My name is Jack. I'm 72 years old. I've lived my whole life in Hollow Creek, Texas. Maybe you've never heard of it here, but it's the kind of place where everyone knows each other by name. I was a mechanic for more than 40 years. I worked with grease, with engines, and with honesty. I raised my children with what I had, and often with what I didn't have as well. Now answer me something. Have you ever been humiliated by someone you raised with all the love in the world? Have you ever heard laughter in the room while feeling pain in my body and shame in my soul? Because I heard. Many people think that the worst thing about old age is loneliness, but I learned that there is something even more cruel, contempt disguised as a joke. And when it comes from the mouth of your own son, it is as if the ground disappears under your feet. If you've ever felt that they laughed at your pain, this video is for you, because I was also silent that day. But what came after? It made my son bow his head before everyone, and I'll tell you how it all happened. But before we dive into the heart of this story, I need you to know something. There was a day at a seemingly ordinary breakfast when my own son pointed his finger at me in front of the whole family and said, "Look at that. It looks like the old man is going to explode like a pus-filled volcano." And he laughed. He laughed out loud. Those laughs, mixed with the smell of coffee and the uncomfortable silence, still echo inside me. I didn't answer. I just kept pouring the coffee, my hands shaking and the pain throbbing in my back. But inside me, at that moment, something was born, something he didn't see, and that, a while later, he made him bow his head in front of everyone. If you've ever been through something similar, if you've swallowed the pain so as not to ruin the moment, if you've ever been the subject of a joke at the table, you prepared yourself, then stay here with me. If you can, leave your like, subscribe. It's not out of vanity. It's just for me to feel that there are more people around. Because this story still hurts me. And tell it out loud. It requires more courage than it seems. That Sunday dawned with the smell of a full house. I had prepared everything as I used to do in the days when my wife was still with me. Pancakes, scrambled eggs, shortbread, strong coffee, and bacon, of course. Bacon has always been the smell that called grandchildren to the table. Hollow Creek seemed quieter than usual that morning. Maybe it was just my heart wanting to believe that there was still peace where there was family. I put on the flowery tablecloth she liked, neatly arranged the cutlery, and left the radio playing an old country song. The pain in my back had been with me for days. An inflamed deep pimple, one of those that don't let you sleep properly or turn over in bed. I used a clean cloth attached with tape under my shirt, just so I wouldn't stain anything. I didn't want to worry anyone. In my mind, that was just another little pain of age. And I had already endured worse. The house was soon filled with voices, hurried steps, childlike laughter, and the smell of cheap perfume. Brian arrived last, as always, with that hurry of someone who never has time for anything, but who wants to be noticed as soon as he enters. He kissed Lisa on the cheek, patted his younger brother on the back, and walked right past me without saying good morning. But I didn't care. I've gotten used to it. Everyone sat down, and I continued standing, arranging the coffee, serving the dishes. It was nice to see the grandchildren laughing, even though I was more like an extra at that table. And it was when I bent over to pick up a platter of pancakes that I felt the shirt sticking to my back. The secretion from the spine must have leaked and stained the fabric. Before I could back off or disguise it, I heard Brian's loud voice. "Look at what the old man has on his back. You're creating a monster there." The room fell silent for a second. Then came the laughter. Some more contained, others wide open. Brian stood up, made a face of theatrical disgust and said, "Dad, are you going to blow this up? It looks like a volcano about to spout pus." I froze, still holding the platter, feeling the warmth of the damp cloth stuck to the skin. I stood still for an instant that seemed like an eternity. Lisa, poor thing, tried to intervene. "Brian, stop. It's not funny." But it was too late. The joke was launched, and like every cruel joke, it sticks. I sat slowly, trying to keep my spine upright so as not to press on the wound. I continued serving the juice as if nothing had happened. But inside, something broke. Not because of the pain of the spine, but because of the certainty that I was completely exposed. Exposed by whom? For my own son. And what hurt the most was seeing the others pretending not to have heard, pretending to laugh nervously, pretending that it was just a family game. No, sometimes the greatest loneliness is being surrounded by people. I ask myself, how many times are we hurt in public and swallow hard just to not make a scene? How many times are we ridiculed by someone who should protect us? If you've been through this, comment here. He writes, I've lived it, or it touched me, just so I know I'm not talking to myself. Sometimes we just need to feel that someone understands. I remained silent, not because I agreed, but because I realized at that moment that my silence was going to scream much louder than any answer. Brian went back to eating as if nothing had happened. Lisa was silent. The rest of the table, well, everyone pretended to continue the conversation, but his eyes avoided mine. And it was there that I felt, for the first time clearly, that I was alone in that house. But what Brian didn't know is that that very morning I started to think, not in revenge, but in justice. Because when respect dies, something inside us wakes up. Now tell me, what would you do if your own child laughed at your pain in front of the whole family? On the next date, I'll tell you what I saw when I looked in the mirror that night, and why, after that, I was never the same. After everyone left the table and started talking in the living room, I went up to my room. I didn't say anything, nor did I complain about the pain. I grabbed a change of clean clothes, slowly entered the bathroom, and locked the door. The first thing I smelled was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was strange. A mix of old sweat with something more, something that came from the inflammation itself. I took off my shirt slowly. The cloth was stained, soaked on the back. I put it on top of the sink carefully, as if carrying a dirty secret. I turned my back to the mirror, stretched my arm as best I could, and used another small hand mirror to try to see the wound. What I saw made my stomach knot. The skin around it was red, warm to the touch. In the center, a yellowish dot began to glow. It was as if my body was creating an animal inside, wanting to get out. The pus flowed slowly, viscous. I tried to clean it with gauze and warm water. Burned. Very much. But what made me lose ground at that moment was not the pain in my body. It was emptiness. The room seemed bigger than ever, too quiet. And in that silence, I heard Brian's laughter from downstairs, tall, loose, as if she were having fun at the expense of my weakness. And then came the sentence, the damn phrase. He said, "Grandpa is rotten inside," in front of the grandchildren, of my grandchildren, in the house I built with my hands, in the home where my wife planted flowers and made cornmeal cake on Sundays. Rotten inside? I sat on the edge of the tub and stood there with the towel in my hands, feeling the hot liquid running down my back and my soul running down my eyes. Cried. But it was a mute cry. I cried like an old man who got tired of being strong, as someone who has spent his whole life trying to keep everything standing, and now it was collapsing on its own. I thought of my wife. She would have taken care of it with such affection. He would have heated some water, put honey in his tea and said, "This will soon pass, Jack." But she was gone, and what remained was this pain without a lap, this silence that no one hears. I stayed there for long minutes. I don't even know how much time has passed. I wiped the wound as best I could, changed my shirt, and returned to the room with slow steps. When I went down the stairs, I saw Brian telling the same joke again to one of the grandchildren. He used his hands to imitate an explosion in his back. Everyone laughed. I just looked down. In that instant, something changed in me. I was no longer going to expect respect from anyone. I was no longer going to ask for space where they didn't want me. And he wasn't going to scream either. But I had decided one thing. No one would ever laugh at my pain without consequence again. And the first consequence It would come sooner than they imagined. But does anyone notice the exact moment when a parent stops expecting gratitude? Because for me, that was the point of no return. And what happened next? No one there was prepared to see it. That night on Clay Street felt warmer than usual. The fan on the ceiling made its effort. It rotated non-stop, but the air remained still, stuffy, heavy. I lay down with difficulty. My back burned, throbbing, as if the spine had become a living, pulsating wound. The sheets stuck to the sweaty skin. I tried to sleep on my side, then on my back, but there was no position that relieved me. And then, as is often the case on nights when the body doesn't help, the mind starts to go backwards. It came like an old movie, little Brian, running in the backyard, screaming, "Daddy, Daddy," with his scraped knee. I took him in my arms, cleaning the wound with soap and water, blowing to soften the burning. Then Brian as a teenager, with his college books in his hands, saying he wanted to be someone big in life. "Dad, I just need a chance. It helps me pay for the first semester, the rest I can handle." And I did. I sold the old car, I worked overtime, I slept on top of a truck part inside the workshop, and I paid every penny. I remember the day of the diploma. He didn't thank me in the speech, but I thought it was nervousness. At his wedding party, I was the last to eat, but that's okay. It was his day. I paid for almost everything, buffet, photographer, even the flowers the bride wanted, imported from California. I was told I was exaggerating, but when a father loves, he really exaggerates. Now, years later, he looks at me as if I were a nuisance, as if I were disposable, and all I achieved was to become his joke. Grandpa is rotten inside. Udays, those words kept in my head. And maybe, at that moment, it was really true. Maybe I was rotting, not because of the pimple, but inside, of sadness, frustration, abandonment. I looked at the ceiling, the light from the pole coming in through the cracks in the blind, and I whispered softly, "It wasn't supposed to be like this." It gave me a tightness in my chest, not a physical squeeze. It was deeper. It was the soul shrinking. Because we spend our lives teaching what respect is, what gratitude is, and in the end, he realizes that no one listened, or worse, that they listened but chose to forget. I turned to the side with difficulty, closed my eyes, but the pain of the spine seemed weaker than the pain of knowing that my own son. I no longer saw myself as a father, just like a useless old man, an old man who bleeds, who stinks, who bothers him. And there, in the silence of my room, for the first time, a question was born within me. What if I stopped trying to keep what has already died? What if instead of being silent, I started to walk away? But not running away. No, walking away with dignity, justly, with the calm of someone who has already understood that love cannot be begged. And it was thinking about this that I fell asleep, between fever and tiredness, not knowing that in a few days the hospital would show me more truths than I was prepared to hear, truths that have exposed those who are on our side and who only tolerate us as long as it is convenient. The next morning the fever still accompanied me, firm as an old dog that refuses to leave. My shirt was wet, my body weak, and my head ached as if I carried the weight of an unresolved entire life. Lisa showed up early. She didn't have to say anything. She saw in my eyes that I couldn't take it alone anymore. He took my suitcase, packed the papers, and took me to the city's hospital, Hollow Creek General. I never liked hospitals. I was always the type who preferred to solve things at home, with tea and silence. But there was no way to push it with hot cloths anymore. In the triage, the nurses did everything not to show fright. But I realized, when they lifted my shirt, their expressions changed. The wound on his back had grown, inflamed, glistening with pus and blood. One of them looked me in the eye with compassion. "Mr. Jack, you were very strong for putting up with this for so long." I shook my head, saying nothing. The doctor came in shortly after, Dr. Whitaker, a calm man with a grey beard and tired eyes. He examined the inflammation carefully, ordered blood tests, and said firmly, It's a deep abscess. There is already a risk of infection in the bloodstream. We will need to do surgical drainage today." I nodded without complaining. When the body has suffered a lot, accepting becomes a gesture of relief. Lisa held my hand. "Everything will be fine, Dad. I'm here, see?" That phrase, I kept it, because at that time, it was the only true affection I felt. While they were preparing me for hospitalization, the doctor asked if I wanted to warn someone in the family. "Your son, maybe," he suggested. Lisa kept quiet. I took a deep breath and said, "If he knows, he's not coming." But still she sent a message, and that's when the nurse, a girl named April, came to me, a little awkwardly. "Mr. Jack, forgive me for telling this, but I heard your son on the phone with someone at the front desk. He said he wasn't coming, that he didn't want to see that. He said that you were disgusting. Disgusting." The word entered my ears and came down tearing. Not because I was new, he had looked at me with contempt before, but because I was now coming in my moment of greatest fragility. As I lay on a cold stretcher with my body crying out for help, he called me disgusting. I closed my eyes. The anesthesia was beginning to take effect, but there was a pain that she couldn't cover, and it was the one that burned me inside. I'm here opening my heart, telling the truth of my story. And if you're still with me, listening, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel. It's not for me, no. It's just so I know that my voice is reaching someone. Because there are things that we can only say after life hits too hard, and I still have a lot stored in here to share with anyone who wants to listen. In the preparation room, I felt alone like never before. There were no flowers, no connections, only Lisa, sitting in the corner, with a steady gaze and a tiredness that only those who take care of someone sick know. She stayed there until the last minute. Before I was taken to surgery, I was fitted with a heated blanket and fasteners on my fingers. The anesthesiologist said it was fast, that I wouldn't even feel it. But what he didn't know was that I had been feeling it for a long time, and that was just the visible part. I closed my eyes, trying to remember my wife, imagining her next to me, running her hand through my hair, saying that everything was going to pass. But in that cold hospital, what didn't pass was the certainty. Brian didn't show up. He didn't even care. He didn't even ask. And it was in that bed, before the anesthesia erased me, that I decided, with all the fatigue in the world, that I would never let him treat me like a weight again. The surgery was a success, they said later, but the emptiness that remained in me, this one had no scalpel that could solve it. And you want to know what surprised me the most? It wasn't Brian's silence. He was the one who appeared later, who held my hand and made me see that sometimes the family that consoles, it comes from where we least expect it. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the next part. Because there, in that hospital bed, something began to change, not only in my body, but in the way I saw the world around me. The days that came after the surgery were slow, but curiously full. The wound on his back was being treated precisely. They drained the pus, cleaned everything, and left me with the bandages changed and my soul open. I thought it would be a time of loneliness. And it was, but not in the way I imagined, because, to my surprise, the loneliness of absence was filled by unexpected presences. On the second day, very early, even before breakfast, they knocked on the door of my room. It was Jimmy, a guy who worked with me in the workshop back in the 90s. She entered with a bouquet of flowers from her sister's flower shop and a corn cake in a plastic lunchbox. "I heard you were here. You taught me how to adjust the carburetor of my first car. I never forgot that. I came to give a hug." The next day, she went to Martha, my neighbor from the corner house. Retired, good at heart, she took a book and a prayer written down on a piece of paper. He sat next to me, read in a low voice, holding my hand. "Jack, you always helped everyone on this street. When my husband fell ill, he was the one who mowed the lawn in my house for weeks. I've never forgotten that. Pastor Leonard also came. He knew me from the time I helped in the maintenance of the church. He brought soft words, Bible in hand and tears in his eyes. 'Son, God is seeing everything, and he does not sleep. He who sows with tears reaps with honor.' That hospital bed, which I thought would be my last corner, became a meeting point for memories. Vivid memories, coming from people I didn't even imagine still remembered me. But do you know who didn't come? The family. Lisa, of course, did not abandon me. She slept in a hard armchair, held my hand during the dressing changes, bought new bedding to make my room cozier. She was there, whole, steadfast. But the rest, nothing. No message from Brian, no link, no need something. And it was this contrast that hurt me. Those who knew little cared. Who I created disappeared. Nurse April, who had known me since the triage, started to call me Mr. Jack, with special affection. And it didn't take long for us to become friends. One day, while changing my dressing, she commented, "There are people who come here with a room full of visitors, but they leave worse than they arrived. And there are people who enter alone, but it comes out stronger." That night, Nurse Tom came to see my chart. He was a Vietnam veteran, one of those men with low speech and a look that carries history. He looked me in the eye and said bluntly, "You're worth more than you think, Jack." Those words stayed with me, like a seed planted in a weary soil. I started thinking about everything I did in life, in the cars I repaired, in the people I helped, in the times I took from the little I had to give to others. No, I was not disposable. It was not invisible. It wasn't disgusting. And it was there, in that bed, with his back still burning, that an idea began to be born. It was not revenge. It was something bigger. Justice. But justice of the kind that does not need shouting nor scandal. Justice that is written on paper, which is done in silence, because maybe it was time to show, in the calmest way possible, that lost respect has a price. And you know what gave me the strength to start? It wasn't anger. It was gratitude. Gratitude for every visit, every flower, every gesture that reminded me of who I was, and who I still am. But what I didn't know is that, while I was getting back on my feet inside, outside, someone began to move with interest. Interest not in me, but for what I had. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in the next part. Because when the will came into play, that's when the game really started. Returning home after the hospital was like going back to a place that was no longer mine. The walls were the same. The smell of old wood mixed with roasted coffee still hung in the air, but something inside me had changed. It wasn't just the body that carried a scar. It was the gaze. I saw everything differently now. The rocking chair on the porch, which had once been my refuge, now felt like a place of waiting. Wait for what? That someone knocked on the gate? That the phone rang? I knew it wasn't going to happen. Lisa spent the first few days coming in every afternoon to help me with the dressings. The wound still festered a little, and the stitches pulled when I moved. It was a bearable pain, but what didn't heal was the memory. I couldn't forget the coffee scene, his laugh, the mocking voice. The audience pretended not to hear, and more than that, the words spoken outside when I wasn't even present. It was Martha, my neighbor, who told her. He passed by with a bag of homemade bread and said, with his eyes narrowed with concern, "Jack, I don't know if I should say this, but I heard your son in the supermarket. He was talking loudly to an acquaintance, not knowing that I was in line next door. He said he wasn't going to get involved with you anymore because, in his words, my father's all rotten. I don't have the stomach to take care of it." She held my hand. I expected some reaction, but I just thanked him and closed the door slowly. In the living room, I sat in the armchair and stared at the floor. The clock ticked, ticked, and I felt a tightness in my chest. Rotten. That word had been accompanying me like a shadow, but at that moment, she didn't hurt me like she used to. She woke me up. Because it was there on that silent afternoon that I realized Brian no longer saw in me the man who had sustained him, nor the father who sacrificed everything to give him a better life. He only saw what was left of me, tiredness, wrinkled skin, the smell of medicine. And if that's how he saw me, so that's how he deserved to be treated. The difference is that I wouldn't return it with hatred. I would return it with lucidity. I got up with effort, went to the office drawer and took the document folder. There were old records, deeds, banknotes, but what really interested me was the will. The previous one was still old, made shortly after my wife passed away. It was outdated, full of clauses that no longer made sense. I sat down at the table, picked up a pencil, and started scribbling. Ideas, thoughts, and more than that, will. For the first time, I was thinking not about what would be fair for everyone, but what would be right with me. It was as if I was finally giving myself the right to choose who deserved to continue being part of my story. And at this point in life, we stop being afraid of what they will think. Fear turns into tiredness, and tiredness, a kind of courage. No, if you've been listening to me this far, keep this phrase in mind. We don't take revenge by screaming. We free ourselves by signing papers in silence. It was there, that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, that I decided to rewrite my ending. I knew it wasn't the end of the line yet, that my time wasn't up yet. But when the end came, I wanted to make everything very clear. Whoever took care of me would deserve gratitude. Whoever humiliated me would learn the weight of forgetfulness. And for that, I would need a good lawyer, an old friend from Austin whom I hadn't seen in a long time. But before you set up that meeting, something happened. A call, an unexpected request. And that's when I discovered that while I healed in silence, there were people counting the days to know when and how much they were going to inherit. In the next part, I'll tell you who came to me and why. And you may be surprised at how much greed can hide behind a smile. It had been a long time since I had been to Austin. The road was long, but the road did me good. The trees on the banks looked the same, but I was no longer the same man who used to drive around. This time I hitchhiked with an acquaintance from the church who didn't ask anything, just dropped me off at the door of Mr. Collins' office, an old lawyer of our family. He was the one who took care of my wife's inventory when she left. A serious, discreet man, one of those who look into the eye and listen without haste. When I walked into his office, he got up from his chair, greeted me firmly and said, "Jack, you took a long time to come back." I replied with a sad smile. "I had to join forces first." We sat down. He took my folder with the documents and began to leaf through it in silence. Then he looked at me and said, "Do you want to tell me what happened?" And then I counted. From breakfast, humiliation, hospital, the visitors who came, and especially those who didn't. When I finished, he took off his glasses, wiped them with a handkerchief and said, "Jack, do you want revenge?" And I, without even thinking, replied, "No. I want clarity. I want to leave everything in place. I want that when my name is read in the future, it will come with truth." We started to review the will right there. The old one still left most of it for Brian. I asked to change. I want Lisa to be the main heir. She took care of me when I needed it most. The rest, I want it to go where there is still respect. Collins nodded. "Do you want to include any justification clauses?" "No," I replied. "I want to attach testimonies. Real, from those who saw it, from those who listened." I gave him the letters I received at the hospital, from Martha, from Jimmy, from Pastor Leonard, from Nurse April, even from old Tom. Each of them wrote what they saw, what he heard Brian say. The sentences, contempt, the absence. Collins read everything carefully. In the end, he looked at me seriously. "Do you want to leave this only in writing, or do you think about recording something? A video, perhaps?" I stared out the window for a while. Outside, the city was running, cars in a hurry, horns, people crossing the street with bags. "No, Collins, I don't need video. The words he used against me, these will be my witnesses. And that's enough," he understood. And in that silence between the two of us, something inside me reorganized, as if the weight began to slowly leave the shoulders. We spent the afternoon finalizing everything. I calmly signed each page. No rush, no anger. Just that feeling that sometimes the greatest strength a man can have, it's knowing when to cut elegantly. You know, there is a time in life when we stop expecting change from others, and it begins to change what can be inside us. I know there are people listening to this now and remembering things that hurt, people who hurt. Silence is swallowed. So, if this is touching you in any way, comment there. Write, "I agree," "I know how it is," or just, "I understand you." Sometimes a phrase like that is all we need to not feel so alone in what we feel. I left the office with the sealed envelope in my hands. Collins walked me to the door. "Jack, are you sure of everything you decided here today?" I smiled with tired eyes and replied, "More than I had on any other day in my life." I returned home in the same silence with which I went. The road felt less heavy, and the heart a little more in peace. But what I didn't know, it was that while I was coming back, someone was already commenting that it was good for the will to come out soon, before it was too late. And that's when I realized the inheritance didn't even have a name yet, but greed already had a voice. Do you want to know who said that? Then wait for the next part, because when greed speaks louder, the truth begins to reveal itself. Thanksgiving has always had a special place on my calendar. Even after my wife was gone, I made sure to keep the tradition going. I prepared the house, the food, arranged the details, as if for one day time would go back and I could pretend that everything was still in place. This year, even with my body still recovering, I decided to make dinner, perhaps out of stubbornness, maybe by farewell. The house was as she liked, lit candles on the table, white tablecloth with embroidery on the ends, glass platters that only came out of the closet at that time. Lisa helped me with everything. He made the potatoes, the mash, the pumpkin pie. I prepared the turkey my way, basting it little by little patiently. The pain in my back still showed signs, but I held on, because I knew that dinner wasn't just another one. They all arrived in the late afternoon. The grandchildren ran around the house, full of energy. The other children settled on the sofas, talking about trivial things. And then Brian arrived. Dress shirt, elegant blazer, politician's smile. He shook hands, hugged the kids, gave Lisa a kiss, and greeted me with a pat on the back that made my jaw lock in pain. "So, Dad, did you survive?" I laughed with a corner of my mouth and shook my head. He continued, "I was talking to the office staff. You're hard to kill, see?" Lisa shot a quick glance in his direction. I just went back to the kitchen, put the breads on the table. We all sat down to eat. The dishes were served. Each one thanked in their own way, some with their heads down, others without even letting go of their cell phones. And then, as I carved the first slice of the turkey, Brian decided to take it a step further. With the fork in one hand and the glass of wine in the other, he turned to me, loud and clear. "Hey, Dad, how is your volcano doing? Has it healed already, or is it still erupting?" The table froze. The laughter was restrained, nervous. Lisa closed her eyes, lowered her head. One of the grandchildren stopped chewing. I looked up at him. I held the meat-cutting knife tight. Inside, the heart beat slower, but on the outside, I smiled. "It's all under control, Brian." That was it, without raising your voice, without returning the rudeness. But in that moment I knew this was the last dinner where we would all be under the same roof. Because what he didn't realize was that every sentence like that, it was a nail in the very coffin of affection. Eat. The conversation returned, little by little. But something was different in the air. Lisa avoided his gaze. The grandchildren were quieter. The silence between the words grew, and I just watched. It was strange. On the outside, it looked like a family together, but inside everyone was alone with their thoughts. I, in my silence, only thought about what the last part of that plan would be like. And how would he react when he learned that for the first time in his life, the father he always thought he could manipulate, I had already signed the pages that would change everything. Because there are people who only realize the value of a presence when they have lost all rights to it. And if you think Brian has crossed the line, wait and see what happened when he found out that his last name had been removed from the pages he most hoped to see. Can you imagine the expression on a child's face when he hears, in front of everyone, that he has been disinherited? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you in the next part, because that's it. That silence has become a sentence. After that dinner, the house became silent again, but it was a different silence. It was not the usual, the one who accompanies old age with serenity. It was the silence of those who have already decided, of those who are no longer expecting change from anyone. I looked around and saw everything with steady eyes. Every photograph on the wall, every dried flower in the vase, every trace of the past. Now it was also proof of my endurance. And everything I went without asking for anything in return. That week, I began to organize what needed to be left in writing. It wasn't just a matter of money. It was a matter of justice. The world might never have applauded me, but at least I would make sure my story was told the right way, with facts, with witnesses. The first letter arrived from the hands of the postman in a white envelope with small print. It was Tom, the Vietnam veteran nurse who took care of me in the hospital. It began, "Mr. Jack, I have never seen someone endure so much pain in silence with such dignity, and I will never forget your son's phrase that I heard in the hallway, 'I don't even want to go in. My father is disgusting.' I was standing by the door, heard, and I never forgot it. I read it silently and kept the letter as if it were a medal. Then came the letter from Martha, my neighbor. He wrote on a flowery paper in shaky handwriting, 'Jack, I heard with these ears him call you rotten in the market. I was in shock. I wanted to defend you, but he spoke loudly as if he was showing off. It hurt me, because I've known you for over 30 years and I know the man you've always been.' The letter came with a piece of cornmeal cake, the same one she took me when my wife got sick. Days later, 2 more envelopes arrived, from men who worked with me in the workshop. One wrote, 'You lent me money when my wife lost her job. If it weren't for that, I would have lost the house.' When he heard what his son said, I cried, because it was you who taught me what respect was, not him. The other, more direct, said, 'I am who I am because of you. Your son doesn't deserve you.' And this letter is the way I found to tell you, you are not alone. Each envelope I opened was a page of memory being stamped with truth. All of this was handed over to Collins. He read each line with the attention of a judge. He set up a folder with the attachments. He said that this was not common in a succession process, but that in that case, it made perfect sense, because I wasn't just messing with inheritance. I was leaving a warning to the world. Who laughs at the pain of a father? He doesn't deserve to sit at the table of what this father built. Collins asked me if I wanted to write something in my own handwriting, a last page, a final text. I thought for a few seconds and said, "No, I have already written my story with actions. Now I let others count. If this piece of my life can become a mirror or a hug for someone, will it help me to carry it forward? Like and subscribe here to the channel. It makes more difference than you think. Sometimes all an old man like me needs is respectful listening. And if this story touches anyone else, then it was worth having lived every part of it." With the briefcase finished, Collins looked at me as someone who understands a little more about the weight I carry. He said, "Jack, that dossier, it is more than a document. It's a portrait of who you really are." I just nodded, eyes downcast. That night I sat on the porch and saw the open sky of Hollow Creek. The stars were more vivid than usual. Maybe it was my wife looking at me. Maybe it was just the clean air after a day of washing my soul. But what I didn't expect was what would come soon after, an official notification marking the day of the public reading of the will. In a notary's office, with all those present, Brian included, and he still had no idea what awaited him. What about you? Can you imagine what happens when an arrogant son thinks he's going to hear his own name as the main heir and find out that you have been cut from history? That's that. In the next part, I'll tell you what it was like to watch this up close, with both feet on the ground and his head held high. In Collins' office that afternoon in Austin, the air was still. The windows let through an orange sun that illuminated the papers on the table, as if even the sky knew that something was being decided there with the weight of a lifetime. I sat down slowly, adjusted my hat on my lap, took a deep breath, and listened, one by one, to the final paragraphs of the New Testament being read in the lawyer's firm voice. It wasn't about money. It was about the end of the cycle, about truth, about making it clear, with written words and a notarized signature, who I was and who deserved to walk with me to the end. The first clause spoke of donation in life. I asked that a portion be sent directly to the hospital in Hollow Creek, the very one where I almost went and where I received more affection from strangers than from my own son. Then, an amount for the church, in the name of my wife, for everything she believed in. For every Sunday she woke up early, she wore her best dress and prayed for her children who today barely remember to light a candle for her. Finally, a budget for the community library. I myself have never been a man of many books, but I know the value of a well-told story, and there on that dark wooden table I was telling mine. Lisa would inherit most of what remained, not out of flattery, but out of presence, out of care, for staying when everyone left, for wiping my sweat and holding my hand even when I just wanted to disappear into the dark of the room. The grandchildren were also included with fair shares so that they would know that the grandfather they heard little about. He did not forget them. And then came the hardest part, but also the most certain. Brian, name crossed out, clear clause, excluded for moral indignity under the terms of article, and so the legal language followed. But inside, each line was an outburst of mine, contained for years. I asked them to attach, without any emotional note from me, just the documents, the letters, the testimonies, that they let the paper speak. Because I learned over time that the firmest dignity is the one that does not scream. It's the one that is written calmly, and it is signed with faith. Collins then looked at me, took off his glasses and said carefully, "Jack, do you want to communicate to the family now? I can send formal copies." I stared at the wall for a moment. The black and white photograph of Austin's old town hanging there seemed to stare back at me. Then I turned my eyes to him and spoke softly. But certainly they will know at the right time, because justice is not announced. Justice reveals itself. At this point in the story, I know you may be wondering, but didn't he deserve a second chance? Couldn't the son change? Look, I wondered that for a long time. But there comes a time when the right question is no longer, will it change? And becomes, why do I keep allowing it? And sometimes, the only way to teach someone who has crossed the line, it is showing that he no longer has access to what he has always taken for granted. And look, if you've made it this far, I'll tell you, what comes next is the moment that marked me the most. Because planning in silence is one thing, but seeing everything happening before your eyes, in the middle of the room, with everyone listening, is quite another. Want to know how the day of public reading went? How did Brian's face change with each line? So don't get out of there, because the next part is when the truth finally stops being hurt, and it becomes justice before all. That afternoon the phone rang, and the number that appeared on the screen was too well known. Brian. It had been a few days since Thanksgiving dinner, and he hadn't heard from him since. I answered calmly. On the other side, the voice was the same as always, confident, light, already full of plans. He started by saying that he had an excellent idea, that he was thinking about opening an investment consultancy in Austin, that he needed an initial boost, and that he wanted to know if I would be up for joining as a minority partner. He used those words as if I were an old retiree with money lying around and with nothing else to do. He said that I could help with the structure, perhaps with a small office and a start-up capital, and that this would bring me closer to the grandchildren. I listened. I didn't say anything at first, I just listened. He spoke fast, as always. Each sentence was filled with expectations, as if everything was already agreed and my part was just to say yes. When he finally paused, I asked, "And why now, Brian?" He laughed, a forced laugh. "Because it's a good chance, Dad. Life doesn't wait, you know, and it's a way to show that we're together, you know, father and son, undertaking." The word together weighed heavily, more than he could imagine. I took a deep breath, looked at the old portrait of my wife that was on the shelf next to it and replied, "Not today." Silence. On the other side, it took him a few seconds to react. "What do you mean today, no? You have the conditions, I know. Won't you support me, Dad? Don't you want to invest in your own child?" That's when my voice came out serene but firm. "Son is the one who takes care, Brian, not the one who humiliates." And I hung up, without raising the tone, without explaining, without fighting. At that moment, for the first time, I felt that the ground that had always been under his feet moved, that he began to realize that something had changed, that the old father who always said yes, who always stretched out his hand, was now silent, but a different silence, a silence that no longer asks, no longer waits, no longer offers itself. Funny how some memories settle inside us as if they were tattoos on the soul. His voice on that phone call, the way he tried to look casual while pressing, all of this echoed for days. And even today, when I close my eyes, I hear his question, "Aren't you going to invest in your own child?" And the answer I gave, without trembling, "A child is the one who cares." Sometimes I think that's where he started to fall. Not because of my revenge, but because the basis that sustained him was my silence, and that silence changed its tone. If you've experienced something similar, someone who only looks for you when they need it, but disappears when it's you who needs it, then I really invite you to leave a comment here. Share with me. Sometimes a simple, "I understand," or "I've been there," makes us feel less alone in the world. The chest of memories that each one carries is a universe. And I'm here, telling mine, hoping to hear a little bit of yours too. After that phone call, I knew. He felt it. He couldn't explain it, perhaps. But he did. And I still didn't know that the next meeting would not be in a casual conversation, nor at a family lunch, but in a notary's room, with people sitting, with attentive eyes, with words that could no longer be undone. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next part. The day the truth was read aloud for everyone to hear, including him. Are you ready for it? Because I've been his whole life. The sun that morning seemed stronger than usual. Maybe it wasn't the heat, but the weight of the day. I got up early, put on my light blue shirt, the one my wife always said matched my eyes, even now faded by time. I didn't make a point of hiding the scar on my back. The collar didn't go up enough, and honestly, I didn't even want it to go up. That mark was part of what I had experienced, part of the story that was about to be told, with all the letters, in front of those who needed to listen. I arrived at the Hollow Creek office 20 minutes before the time. Mr. Collins was already there, arranging the papers with his usual calmness. He looked at me respectfully and said only, "It's all set." I nodded. Inside, the heart beat differently. It wasn't nervousness. It was a mixture of relief and expectation. After everything I had experienced, the physical pain, the humiliation, the abandonment, I was finally there, in the right place, with the truth by my side, and the silence. Still with me, but now heavier. A silence that had a name, documents, and witnesses. The chairs were gradually occupied. Lisa arrived with the boys. One of them ran up to me and hugged me tightly, asking if I was better. "Yes, I am, son," I replied, my throat tightening. Next to her, Pastor Miller from our church, Mrs. Grace from the library, and Nurse Tom. Neighbors, former employees, all invited by me. Not as an audience, but as living witnesses of what I was and how I was treated. And then, with 2 minutes to go, Brian walked in, expensive grey suit, shining shoes, impeccable hair. He greeted those present as if he were a host. "Good morning, everyone," he said loudly, looking around with that same air of superiority. He gave me a brief but cold smile and sat down cross-legged, adjusting his wristwatch. I had no idea what was coming, and even if he was suspicious, I wasn't prepared. Collins adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. First, he explained that the meeting had as its objective the official reading of the updated will in the presence of witnesses. He said that, at my express request, all the names mentioned would have the right to be there, to hear every clause, every justification, every penny of what would be left. His voice was firm, unhurried. Every word seemed to weigh heavily in the room. The beginning was quiet. Donations to the hospital, the church, the library. The faces around me lit up. The pastor smiled. Grace held my hand, then the amounts destined to the grandchildren. Lisa stood still, teary-eyed. Brian maintained his posture, only slightly shaking his foot. I knew his name would come last, as he had always been in life, the center of attention. But then Collins paused, breathed. He took a brown envelope from his briefcase and said, "Before proceeding with the final clause, the testator requested the attachment of documents supporting his decision. Letters, testimonies, all read and recorded in this process." And it began. The first was a letter from Martha, my neighbor, telling her what she heard in the market. Brian saying that I was rotten inside and that even the smell couldn't stand it. Then Tom's letter, describing the days in the hospital, the moans of pain, the abandonment. There was also the testimony of Marcos and Jimmy, former employees of the workshop that I helped to start over when they lost everything. They remembered how much I did for Brian and how painful it was to see him treat me like a burden. As each testimony was read, Brian's face changed. At first he tried to laugh as if it was all exaggeration. Then it turned red, finally silent. The arrogance was melting into cold sweat. With each word, the room became denser. The people around him no longer looked at him in the same way. Some looked away. Others faced it with disappointment. Collins then held up the last sheet, the most awaited, final clause. In view of the recorded testimonies, the repeated behavior of disrespect, moral abandonment and effective indignity, Mr. Jack Thomas declares, of his own free will, that his firstborn son, Brian Thomas, is formally excluded from the legitimate succession. No good, value or benefit will be transferred to him after the death of the testator. Silence. Absolute silence. I could only hear my own breathing. Brian rose to his feet. "That's a joke, isn't it? Father, this is not serious. This is absurd." I stood too. I looked at him, and he said firmly, "You called me a pus volcano. He left me alone in the hospital. He said I was rotten. But Brian, what's rotten is not my body. It's the respect you've lost. That's it. It is not inherited." He turned pale. His mouth trembled. He tried to step forward, but Collins raised his hand. "The reading is done." I sat down again. Lisa cried silently. The grandchildren looked at me confused. Brian left the room without saying anything else. And there, at that moment, I knew something had ended. But another thing was just getting started. Do you believe that even after all this, did he still try to come back? That he still had the audacity to look for me once again? So listen to the next part, because what happened after that was even more unexpected. Brian was still standing when Mr. Collins resumed speaking. The tension in the room could be cut with a knife, but he, with that composure of decades in the office, continued reading with the same firmness as a judge facing a sentence. First, the details of the living donations, the new wing of the hospital that would bear my late wife's name, the children's space in the Hollow Creek Library, and the money for the church where I got married, my grandchildren, each with a small savings for studies. Lisa, my daughter, with most of the inheritance, not out of favoritism, but out of presence, by the hand extended when the rest turned their faces. The atmosphere began to weigh even more when Collins announced that the annexes that justified my decision regarding Brian would be read next. He tried to interrupt. "Look, this is unnecessary. I already understand the message. You don't need to dramatize." But Collins ignored him. "It began with Martha's account. I heard Brian in the aisle of the Main Street Market saying, 'My dad's falling apart and they still want me to take care of him.' Then came Tom, the nurse, with a voice cracked in a previously recorded video. I saw that man crying in pain and abandonment. He never complained, but his silence hurt more than any scream." Brian laughed. He laughed nervously, awkwardly, saying that they were exaggerating, that it was all a misinterpretation. But the next document was from Marcos, who now runs a workshop in San Antonio. It was Jack who taught me everything I know. When my son got sick, he sold his own car to help me pay for the treatment. To see his son mock the pain of a man like him, it revolted me. Jimmy, who has been with me for almost 20 years, wrote, "It's not just about the spine. It's about disrespect, ingratitude, abandonment. Jack deserved care, not shame." Brian folded his arms. He tried to whisper to Lisa, but she walked away. The pastor stared at him, disappointed. The lawyer then read Grace's letter from the library, where she said that I donated children's books every month on behalf of my grandchildren, even though I didn't know if they would ever thank me for it. When Collins finished, silence was heavier than any direct accusation. Brian lowered his head for the first time. Not out of remorse, not yet, but because he realized that there was no way to hide it anymore. The words had been spoken. The truth was there, printed, signed, read aloud. And me? I didn't say anything. I remained seated, hands on my lap, eyes steady on the wall. I didn't need to say anything. Each of those accounts was a part of my pain put on paper, and the absence of my voice was the living memory of everything he ignored. When the reading was over, Mr. Collins took a deep breath and said, "That was Jack Thomas's wish. Clear, conscious, backed by documents and testimonies. It's closed." Brian also tried to say, "Dad, this is not fair. This was all very heavy. You could have talked to me. This here was a humiliation." But I just stood up and said, without raising my voice, "Son, he who sows shame cannot complain about the harvest." And I left the room, leaving the sound of the papers being put away and the silence he finally had to hear. But what he did after that, no one expected it. Do you want to know what happens when someone who has always been on top feels the weight of the ground for the first time? So just wait until I tell you what he did in the days that came after. He didn't understand right away. I think it took a good few seconds to sink in, when Collins, in a firm voice and without a comma out of place, declared, "By express and justified will, Brian Matthews is officially disinherited. He will not receive any part of the goods arranged here." The room was paralyzed. Time seemed to double. Brian gave a short, mocking laugh, as if it were a bad joke. But no one laughed with him. Nobody. He stood up, slamming his fists against the sides of his pants. "This is crazy. This is manipulation. This old man doesn't know what he's doing." Lisa stared at him firm. Collins only replied, "Mr. Jack is lucid," and all proceedings followed legal standards with independent witnesses. Brian swirled around him, as if looking for an ally in the room. No gaze crossed his. Even little Emily, my youngest granddaughter, began to cry softly on her mother's lap. The sound of that child sobbing seemed to be the only real noise there. I kept quiet. I was sitting by the window, watching outside. The Hollow Creek Square remained the same. The wind swayed the leaves of the tree where I used to sit with my wife. The cafe on the corner served the Sunday customers with the same affectionate slowness. The city followed. Life went on, and so did I. Brian approached. His steps no longer had the security he carried when he entered that room. His hands trembled. He stood before me and murmured in a low, trembling voice, "Father, you can't do that to me. I am your blood. I am your son." I stared at him without anger, without shouting. I just looked him in the eye, and after a long silence, I said, "It was you who decided to be less than that." He lowered his eyes. For the first time, he had no argument, no irony, no escape. He still tried to hold my hand, but I backed away slowly, like someone who removes a hot cup from the table so as not to burn himself. There are things that we live and keep, but maybe by telling, we help another heart to breathe. Enjoy this video and subscribe, and let's make this story reach those who need it. Because sometimes we think we're the only one going through a wound that we can't see. But my friend, there are a lot of people out there, quietly, carrying pain and dignity in the same chest. After that day at the registry office, Brian left alone. His car was the newest and the most expensive in the parking lot. But at that moment, It seemed small in the face of the shame he carried on his shoulders. I saw him through the reflection of the window. He stopped on the sidewalk, looked back, as if waiting for someone to run out and ask him to come back. No one went. Me neither. He got in the car and drove away, and when the engine disappeared in the corner, a part of me felt the weight of it all. It was not a victory, it was not pleasure, it was just silence. The same silence that he had ignored for so long was now what was left between us. I knew that silence would be the greatest punishment he had ever faced, because there is no inheritance, diploma, or money that can buy the peace of a father who looked you in the eye and no longer saw a child there. But if you think that's where it ended, no, there was more. A few days later, he did something I never imagined, something that almost took me apart. Want to know what it was? Just wait. His time was just beginning. Brian fell to his knees. It was so sudden that not even the eyes of those present followed. All you could hear was the dry thud of his pants touching the wooden floor of the registry office. He cried. He really cried, like a lost boy, with no more certainty in the world. The words came out tangled between sobs and sighs, and Dad, forgive me. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know I was hurting you like that. It was just a joke. Everyone laughed. I thought that was it. Joke. I looked at him and saw the boy I once carried on my shoulders, there in the lake of Hollow Creek, trying to reach an apple from the highest foot of the tree. That same boy who cried in fear of the dark and asked me to stay until he fell asleep. But the man who was kneeling there was no longer that boy. He was someone who, with time, comfort, and ego, chose to mock his own father, hurt with words, and laugh at the pain of others. My pain. I took a deep breath. I looked at everyone in the room. No one moved. The silence was not constrained, it was reverent. And then I spoke, low but firm, so that each syllable would sink deep. When you laughed at my pain, you took away from me something that no money gives back. Respect. Brian looked up. His eyes were red, teary, but there was still a hint of expectation in them, as if it were just the beginning of a forgiveness that would soon come. But I continued without hesitation. You didn't laugh at a pimple, Brian. You mocked what I had endured in silence. You stepped on the little I had left that day, the attempt to maintain my dignity in the face of pain. And now, the same silence you ignored. It is he who answers you. There, my friends, it wasn't anger that I felt. It was not revenge. It was a bitter peace, hard to swallow but necessary. I got up from my chair. My knees hurt, as always. The scar on his back still throbbed, as if his skin remembered what he had experienced. But the soul was steadfast. And then I turned my back and walked to the door. Every step of mine on that old floor echoed loudly. It seemed that the wooden clubs were screaming in my place. Brian was still on the ground, and no one, absolutely no one, dared to interrupt. There are things that we go through quietly for so long, that when we finally speak, it's not to convince anyone. It's just to put the final point that was missing in the story, and I knew that this point was not yet the end, because life still had one last gesture, one last twist that none of us expected, and when it came, she came with force. Want to know what it was? I'll tell you, because sometimes what seems closed, he still keeps his final lesson. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was louder than the buzz of the witnesses. Collins held out the will before me and said, as if handing over a closed chapter, "Here it is, Jack. Everything is according to his will." I signed it. The steady hand, no trembling. One by one, the others also signed. Lisa, the church representatives, Pastor Roy, even Nurse Tom, who had come in uniform with his badge hanging in his pocket. Nobody said much, but the eyes said it all. It was not a day of victory. It was a day of relief, like when we take off a tight shoe after a long walk. When all the signatures met on the same page, Collins declared, "It's done. Now it's official." I thanked him with a discreet nod. I stood up, adjusted my shirt over the scar, still sensitive, even after so many bandages, and looked at Lisa. She smiled tenderly, as only those who have seen the pain up close know how to smile. He offered me his arm. and I accepted. We left the registry office together. Outside, Hollow Creek seemed to breathe along with me. The sun was already preparing to rest behind the hills. The golden light licked the sidewalks, and the branches of the trees moved slowly in the light wind. The air had the smell of late afternoon mixed with old memories. I walked to the registry office sign, where the sign read, "Civil Registry and Notary of Hollow Creek, since 1954. I leaned there for a moment, as if leaning my tired body against a memory that was once more painful. I took a deep breath. No, there is a time in our lives when the wound no longer burns, it just stays there, scarred, remembering that we survived. And I survived. No to infection, no to physical pain, but to contempt, to oblivion, to humiliation in silence. I always thought that respect was a two-way street, but I learned that when the other party decides to abandon driving, we need to stop our hearts and go on foot. Alone if necessary. It was not sadness what I felt there. It was a kind of peace. One of those that we don't celebrate with fireworks, but with a long sigh. I didn't leave the registry office like a father who beat his son. He left like a man who said goodbye to the last hope of being seen with eyes of gratitude for the one he once carried in his arms. That silence, after the signing, was deeper than any speech, and as I looked at the sky tinting the rooftops of Hollow Creek orange, I knew deep in my chest that this story still had one more thing to give me. One last scene, one last card, the time was yet to turn, and when she arrived, oh, my friend, it was there that life took me by surprise once again. Are you ready to know what happened? So just listen, because there's more. I moved in on a clear morning, as if even time knew that I needed to start over in silence. The new house is near Lake Buchanan, surrounded by trees that dance in the wind, and a simple garden that I started to tend myself, with my hands already a little shaky, but still firm enough to plant and prune. This place was an old dream of mine and Margaret's. We talked about it on summer nights, sitting on the porch, drinking iced tea. She said, "One day, Jack, we will live in a corner of peace, just ours." And now, even alone, I kept my promise. Here the days pass unhurriedly. I wake up early, walk slowly to the lake, sit on a wooden bench and let time embrace me. I take a book. Sometimes I just look at the leaves floating in the water. There is no city noise. No one is in a hurry. Only the birds, the smell of the wet earth, and my memory walking with me. Lisa always calls, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the late afternoon. He talks about his grandchildren, the new school project, sends me photos. The children send letters, scribbled in colored pencils, with trembling hearts and crooked phrases like, "I love you, Grandpa Jack." I keep them all in a wooden box that I leave on top of the dresser, along with a photo of Margaret. It's my way of keeping love close, even if the house is silent. From time to time, one of the boys who worked with me in the workshop appears. They bring cake, news, souvenirs. They sit with me on the porch, remember the stories of cars that we saved from the junkyard, of the nights we turned to finish urgent work, and they always say a similar phrase, "You deserve this rest." I smile and think, yes, maybe I deserve it. After so much loading, it was time to rest. Brian, he didn't call anymore. Not a message, not a note, not an attempt. They said that he is quieter out there, who left the law firm for a while, who looks dejected. I don't wish harm on him. I just don't want anything else. It is as if the pain has dried up the affection, not with anger, but with that kind of sadness that we don't fight with her anymore. We just learn to live with her. The scar on your back still stings sometimes, especially when the weather changes. But it doesn't bother me as much as before. Today, it just reminds me that I was hurt, and I survived. The truth, my friend, is that I found peace in the very place where I once dreamed of living. Away from the noise, far from the expectations that weighed like lead, close to me, of who I really am. I thought I needed to be seen, recognized, applauded by my friends, but I realized that it was enough to be true to myself. And there's one thing I wanted you to keep. If you've come this far listening to me, sometimes the forgiveness we need to offer is not for the other, it's for ourselves. Forgive for having waited so long, for having believed too much, for having insisted where there was no longer a road. That is also liberation. But look, life still had one more chapter for me, one last visit. A last meeting which I didn't expect, but which made me see everything with different eyes. Want to know who showed up at my door unannounced? Well then, follow me in the next part, because it was there that, even after everything, my heart was tested once again. I'm here now, sitting by Lake Buchanan, with a cup of warm tea in my hands, feeling the wind blow on my face, and the smell of wet earth rising slowly. Sometimes I close my eyes and remember everything. The breakfast, the cutting joke, the cold hospital, the silence that weighed more than screaming. And I also remember the notary's office, the witnesses, the words that I never had to say out loud because they were already written in the eyes of those who saw them. Brian never showed up again. And you know what? You don't have to. I don't hold hatred, I just don't save more space. He took from me what time does not return, the innocence of thinking that love alone was enough. Today, when someone asks me how this story ended, I only answer like this. My son called me disgusting because of a pimple, and he ended up begging for something I could no longer give: forgiveness. The skin healed, the soul too. Not because he deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved my peace. Life has taught me that not every tie is a knot. Some need to be undone so that we can keep breathing. I learned that silence can be more powerful than any speech, and that sometimes dignity doesn't scream. It just goes away in silence without looking back. We fool ourselves into thinking that we have to scream to be heard, when in fact, what changes everything is the moment when we stop begging to be seen. Love is not insistence. Love is reciprocity and respect. And respect is the only air that should never be forgotten. If you've stayed with me so far, I want to thank you for real. It's not easy to open your chest and tell a story like this, but if it served to warm your heart or remind you of your own strength, then it was worth it. Help me spread this message. Leave a like here in this video. For me, it's like a silent hug that warms the soul and supports this little corner that we build together. If you want to keep coming here to have a coffee with me, subscribe to the channel. This space is yours too. And tell me in the comments where you're watching. I want to know your city, your corner of the world, to know how far this story has come. And it activates the bell, see? That way you don't lose when the coffee is brewed again. And if you think that was a strong story, just wait to hear the next one. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, each wrinkle tells a story, and each story carries a strength. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.